I'm going to move very smoothly, actually, to introduce our next speaker, who knows an awful lot about thermodynamics and made me promise that I wouldn't speak publicly about it until I passed everything past him. So I'm going to find out later tonight what I did wrong, where I got it all wrong. But more importantly, Professor Brian Fleck here has been talking to me about war. It's from the Department of Mechanical Engineering at the University of Alberta. And he's been talking to me for a while about war. And I've always found what he says to be very provocative and thought-provoking. And I think it was almost set as a challenge to talk about thermodynamics, and I'm sure what I've come up with was a disappointment, but we're likely to get a much more robust, I think, discussion of war. He's come all the way from Canada to do this, so I'm very grateful for that. He's suffering from jet lag, but I don't think you'll notice. I'm passing the floor over to you, Brian.
Thank you. And just to preface this, I am a mechanical engineer, and I have been studying war and how it relates to science for quite a while, mostly in my spare time. But one thing I wanted to talk about today, and it makes my talk quite a bit different than everyone else's, is that I'm going to try to put forward a thesis here that we have at our disposal a fair bit more information than we can use to help us predict and understand what's happening in the conflict in Ukraine. But the average person is not really, doesn't really have access to the kind of information that a lot of people who are experts in it do. And in the media, which really forms most of the understanding of what is happening, it appears that we are intentionally not being told some of the worrying numbers that are in front of NATO in the current situation. And when we talk about surprises, we are, just like Sun Tzu and Clausewitz said, I mean, one of the most important things to do in war is to make sure your adversary doesn't know what you're doing, more or less. But in a world with the internet and media, to keep your enemy in the dark also means you need to keep your own people and their people in the dark. And that is actually the situation we're in right now. And so the way to know what is going on, which I find also applies to a lot of things that I do, I actually do most of my research in renewable energy. And the transition to renewable energy, I've seen the same thing, people talking about things quantitatively without actually having a full understanding of the numbers they're talking about. So we've got the whole world talking about a green transition with almost nobody really having a firm grasp of what it means and what sustainability means and what it means in terms of a cost to our standard of living and the kind of sacrifices that we're thinking about here. So without being too negative, I'll jump to my paper. So what I did was I tried to only cite sources for this paper that were Western sources, so pro-NATO and United States, but skeptics. So you can, at the same time in this matter, look at the kinds of sources that are available from the other side, from Russia and their allies, or China, or different media there. But I've decided not to cite any of those, not because I think they're wrong, but because I think by citing our own sources, we know more or less the biases involved. We are predisposed to believe that we're in a good situation heading towards victory. And nevertheless, we have quite a bit of information available to us if you look for it, which is quantitative, that would show you we are actually in quite a bad situation. And we need to be aware of that. So I'll just go through reading my paper, and when I cite somebody, I'll maybe do air quotes or something like that. I try to cite experts in either the media or defense experts from either the United States, the United Kingdom, or NATO. So the Western conversation about how to approach, understand, and plan for the unfolding conflict in the Ukraine has put too little emphasis on analysis backed up by metrics quantifying personnel, firepower, mobilization, range, effectiveness, combat readiness, cost deliverability, stockpiles, and consumption rates. In the West, we have grown accustomed to seeing products and market capitalization which are not well correlated with mundane metrics of sale, performance, and reliability. We're kind of in a marketing culture. And that affects the way we perceive war, and it's very dangerous, I believe. So the pivot of Western globalized liberal economies to services, finance, and marketing, which we saw mostly in the 80s, is vulnerable to the ultimate test of material deliverability of capability, and that is war. And so you can't talk your way out of a war with marketing. And that is one of the things that we're running into right now. So the divergence from what can be demonstrated with quantitative metrics and what is stated simply to influence opinion will make for greater and greater shock when the true state of the situation is in plain sight. Bad news is difficult to accept, but necessary. So recently, the head of the U.S. European Command, Christopher Cavoli, was recently quoted saying, "The scale of this war is out of proportion with any of our recent thinking." Okay, and so this is a man who knows what he's talking about and is pro-NATO. The single greatest deficiency of NATO's strategy seems to be in understanding the scale of this conflict and its potential to grow, and on how engaging in total war is a test of raw material, technological, and human output. One would think that World War II would have provided ample evidence that the deliverability of human and technological might define a nation's ability to wage war. There are frequent comparisons between this conflict and to World War II without carefully showing the vast differences in Western economies then and now, and dangerously not noticing how Russia and China continue to have immense access to manufacturing and material resources, unlike us. Furthermore, in the case of Russia, they benefit from easy access and supply to the war theater and culturally see themselves under existential threat. So all of these things are vast disadvantages to us in this situation. The pivot in Western economies towards services, or what they call the FIRE economy, the finance, insurance, and real estate economy, around the 1980s was seen as a logical way for the financial globalized economy to access manufacturing and resources while leveraging the control over banking and finance. And that really became the West's trump card, that we were kind of controlling the paperwork and the services industry, and that we could get other people to make things for us. Western economies have allowed their ability to produce war material to dwindle, perhaps without changing the posture of defense policies that go with it. In other words, we're losing the ability to do the things that other manufacturing economies do without modifying our stance towards those other countries. The policies for procurement and development of arms in the US, which essentially is the deliverer of arms for all of NATO, is through private corporations who conduct research funded by government agencies. The objective and fiduciary duties of arms manufacturers is to maximize shareholder value. This seems to have put greater emphasis on expensive weapons delivered in small quantities, providing a sense that the massive and growing defense budget scaled linearly with total cost. What I'm saying there is that by measuring the US's budget, it has, for a lot of people, equated to its fighting capability. But a lot of what the US uses is extremely overpriced and has not been tested in the field very much. So another pro-NATO commenter, Alex Vershinen's article, The Return of Industrial Warfare, does an excellent job in quantifying some of the urgent issues arising from the West's planning and approach to the Ukraine conflict. So he recently said, strategy relies on flawed assumptions about the future of war and has been influenced both by the bureaucratic culture in Western governments and the legality of low-intensity conflicts. Currently, the West may not have the industrial capacity to fight a large-scale war. Basically, plainly put, it's about delivering things and making things and putting them on the field. Further, in the details of this article, we find some alarming figures were not well understood by the Western public about the situations, stating that the U.S. annual artillery production would at best only last 10 days to 2 weeks in a combat with Ukraine. That's the entire annual fabrication of ordnance by the United States would be used up in 10 days. or that Lockheed Martin produces about 2,100 Javelin missiles, which you heard a lot about in the news. So 2,100 Javelin missiles per year, and in Ukraine they're using 500 per day. So that we're producing currently 4 days supply of Javelin missiles per year to fund this conflict. So indeed, the sheer numbers of ammunition and ordnance which can be delivered by NATO or Russia are outrageously imbalanced by what and should be a cause for the West to temper its belligerent posture in this conflict. So another commenter, Zabrowski, noted that the war in Ukraine has demonstrated that consumption rates in high-intensity warfighting units, warfighting remain extraordinarily high, and that resilience demands a capacity to build new units, produce spare parts and ammunition, and have sufficient stockpiles to remain competitive. Another recent study done by the U.S. Army was done by a uniformed Captain Jones was his name, comparing extremely expensive Javelin missiles to the traditional anti-tank devices, and basically found that they're the same capability. So we have rockets that are 10 times more expensive that when tested are just as good as the old kinds that we had. And this was done by the United States. So apart from the quantity and deliverability of arms, the effectiveness and poor state of maintenance of costly weapons systems in NATO's arsenal has been discussed in important circles. With NATO's expectation of strategic dependence on air superiority for its operational doctrine, the 2018 Government Accountability Office, that's the United States Government Accountability Office, states that the U.S. Air Force is in an unacceptable state of unreadiness, with planes which are obsolete and replacement generations coming in at huge costs. So this kind of shows that the long period of peace that we've enjoyed, it might have been wise for us to, during that time, also change our strategy or our position because we are acting like we are a lot more well-armed than we are right now. A recent assessment of a store of 28 Puma armored fighting vehicles in Germany revealed that not a single one was combat ready. So they pulled out 18 Puma armored fighting vehicles and found that none of them were in working order. So we're stockpiling used, old, obsolete arms and talking about them like they're modern weapons, such as a Leopard tank or an F-16. They're 40 or 50-year-old weapon systems. And this would be like fighting in World War II, well, as some countries did, on horseback. It just wasn't a good plan because you're really behind in important capabilities. So the most urgent deficiency in NATO's war-making capability appears to revolve around critical capabilities in low-cost drone production, air defense, and long-range missiles. So some other commenters, I can give you the paper, but with the citations, documented startling effectiveness of Russian anti-drone tools and accurately predicted that any engagement with Russian forces would reveal their tendency to play to their strengths. And this is a quote: "The delivery of armored vehicles, short-range anti-tank weapons, and air defense systems can only be useful in one scenario, one which is likely to be preceded by a harrowing and extensive period of non-contact warfare designed to prevent the Ukrainian armed forces from operating effectively at all." We just saw this in the last 2 weeks, where the Ukrainian counteroffensive did not actually arrive at the front lines of Russia before it was annihilated and retreated. So their engagement distance of the Russian forces with their K-52 Alligator helicopters is beyond the range of any of the Ukrainian infantry that was deployed. So this is very frightening. So a description of how Russia came to have such a dramatic strategic advantage in long-range missiles and air defense is well explained by an author in the States who is Russian, and I would say is stridently pro-Russian, so I kind of warn my readers about that, but his knowledge in this area is very impressive. And his name is Martyanov, Alexandre Martyanov. He argues that the Russian capabilities in hypersonic missiles and air defense diverged roughly 20 years ago. And he places that back when there was a break between Russia and NATO on ballistic missile treaties. And when this happened, the Russians decided that it was an emergency 20 years ago It was an emergency for them, and they had to immediately scale up their capability in long-range missiles and air defense. And at that time, as you all know, the United States was focusing on counterinsurgency and anti-terrorism. And so those two strategic situations leave us in a bad situation because the Russians are inherently prepared for total war on the ground, and we have been focusing on fighting counterinsurgents in Afghanistan. And so, as you know, the United States recently retreated from Afghanistan with very little to show for it, whereas right now Russia is in a very good position of their own because they spent the last 20 years preparing for total war. So the catch up with such game-changing technologies will take a long time. That's the point. We hear talk about NATO and other countries trying to catch up. It's simply going to be very difficult for that distance to be made up because the advances in technology are so important. We have focused on essentially intelligence and doing things with software and a lot of covert operations. That's become more or less NATO's strength. And their strength has been with these long-range weapons, standoff weapons, which affect not just the infantry, more importantly, the Navy. Because the kind of things that Russian fleet can deliver at a range of 1,500 kilometers is outside the radar range of most ground radar that NATO has. In other words, they can strike by surprise with no response from us, with the kind of ordnance they have. So overall, the current penchant for NATO to rely upon spin to deflect the apparent mistakes in strategy will have to be addressed at some point. The current approach looks more like a concerted effort to slowly entangle NATO in an unwinnable conflict, and I say that very seriously, that there are people who want to escalate this, probably because it's profitable for them. People, like a lot of people who are reading the news, are not seeing a lot of these numbers. So the most troubling spin seems to be around the number of casualties in this conflict. The most bothersome tell that I find is how assessments of losses by Western forces bounce around all the time and are contradicted by different Western sources all the time, whereas the Russian Ministry of Defense has a graph on their webpage that shows what their estimate of losses is. And so even Ursula von der Leyen had to retract her statement of 100,000 losses in Ukraine, which was exactly what the Russians said were the losses at that time. So these are Ukrainian losses, and that was months ago. So, you know, usually when you're trying to figure out what is the reliable source of truth, you know, you have to go with what is most predictive of outcomes. This is kind of the direction you have to go. So whatever strategy we're employing, a greater degree of transparency and validation with quantities that can be measured and assessed is needed. We face a time when the global image of the West is also diverging from the East. And this is another thing that a lot of people aren't aware of. Our ability to play the role of the good guys is also in peril. So if you look at a survey done, a recent Gallup poll comparing the opinion of who are the most hated countries in the world, they've consistently been China, Russia, and the United States. But if you divide what the opinion is of those three countries between the richest billion people in the world and everybody else, you get a very different answer. And that it is the view by people in the poorest countries in the world of China and Russia is not as low as it is in the rich countries. And so that has an important effect on what we see strategically right now. So just to sum that up, in the poor, the rest of the country, I call them the other 7 billion, we have 70% have a positive outlook towards China, and 66% feel positively towards Russia. So our own perception of us being the good guys is something we have to be careful of too, because that's another source of surprise to us that potentially could cause problems. So thanks very much for that.